You are listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to C-Suite Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. I'm Dana Peterson, Center Leader of the Economy, Strategy, and Finance Center at the Conference Board, and guest host of today's episode. Joining me today is Stephanie Guichard, Senior Economist and leader of our Global Indicators practice, and Alex Heil, Senior Economist and leader of our Energy, Infrastructure, and Environment practice. In today's conversation, we'll discuss the latest U.S. Consumer Confidence Survey, as well as the state of the global energy transition. Welcome, Stephanie.
Hey, Dana.
So, Stephanie, do consumers feel more or less confident right now?
So they are definitely feeling less confident in September than in August. However, we're still above the April number when they were really feeling gloomy about the economy. Right now, our measure of consumer confidence is at 94.2, which is still well above the April level where it was at 85.7.
What were the top mentions from consumers about factors affecting the economy?
So this month, the reference that came the most often was references to inflation, prices, cost. This was the top concern of consumers in 2024. In April, it was taken over by tariffs, which became the most frequent reference in terms of what's affecting consumers' use of the economy. Now it's back to inflation, but tariffs are just coming second, so it's still a very huge concern for consumer, and it's mostly associated with comments that this is going to lead to some price increases.
Thanks, Stephanie. Did these perceptions also show up in any of the other indicators from the survey? For example, you have inflation expectations, spending habits, stock market, and even rate expectations. Did you see any of those measures reflect the top mentions in terms of things affecting the economy?
In terms of inflation expectation, it's a bit odd because although inflation is the main concern now for consumers, their inflation expectation is a little bit in September. That said, they remain way above the level where they were at the end of last year. So that's one thing. What we see also is consumer in the months got much less positive about their financial situation, which could be also linked to consumer feeling that prices are increasing, especially on imported goods, which make them a bit less happy about their current financial situation. One thing I wanted to mention also is in the issues that are worrying consumers, we saw an increase in references to the labor market. And this is one that is clearly reflected in the measure of consumer confidence. When we ask consumers how they feel about the current state of the labor market, we see a sharp deterioration in the months. And this is the 9 months where it has been declining. And this is really in line with what they are saying in the writing responses, because they mention more and more labor market issues.
Thank you. So given greater mentions or increased mentions of labor market conditions, have recession expectations over the next year changed?
Not really. So they are quite stable. But what we saw, and which is a bit surprising, we saw an increase in the share of consumers thinking that the economy is already in recession, which is a bit odd given the current economic situation, but it really reflects that some consumers are not happy with the present economic situation.
So overall, was it the present situation or expectations that drove the change in the overall consumer confidence index?
So it's really both decline. So both consumers' expectations decline and consumers' views of the present situation weaken also. However, the one that declined the most is consumer views about the present.
Okay, what within the present situation index, because I know that there are two different measures, which one had the greatest impact on the present situation?
So they both had a similar impact. So that's one thing. And the two measures that go into the present situation index, how consumer view the current business conditions and how consumer view the labor market conditions. On the business condition, it's been going up and down in the past few months. So there is no clear trend on that one. We saw a deterioration this month after some improvement in the past few months. There is no clear direction on this one. It's hovering around the same level. However, if you look at the labor market conditions, which measures it's a differential between consumers thinking that jobs are plentiful versus the share of consumers thinking that jobs are hard to get. So we still have a positive number, which means we still have more consumers thinking that jobs are plentiful than consumers thinking that jobs are hard to get. However, the gap has been declining steadily since the beginning of the year. So that's a clear trend, and it reflects what we see on the job openings. We know that there are fewer job openings, and this is clearly reflected in how consumers feel about the labor market.
Thank you. And yes, absolutely. We've seen fewer job openings and few payroll gains, but there hasn't been much firing. So that's at least good news that those who are able to keep, who are working are still, there's still demand for that labor. So let's move on to the expectations gauge. What showed changes in the month?
You have three components in the expectation gauge: future business condition, future labor market condition, and future income. So the first two, future business condition and future labor market condition, weakened a little bit in the month. However, future income improved. And to me, that's a sign that the economy is still quite robust. If consumers are expecting their income to increase in the next 12 months, it means that despite the concern about the labor market in general, they are not very worried about losing their jobs, which kind of it's in line with what you mentioned earlier, Dana, is that there are not so much layoff currently in the economy. So people who have a job, they are not especially concerned about losing their job and their future income, which is supporting the expectation component right now.
That's great. Just given the fact that consumers are not incredibly worried about having a job in the future and also think that their incomes are going to continue to grow positively. How does this reflect on what consumers say about the present situation and the future of their finances?
So it's very interesting this month because we really saw a decline in consumers' views about their current financial situation. And in fact, this was the sharpest decline since we started to ask the question in the summer of 2022. So consumers are expressing concern about their financial situation right now. Not really concern, is still in positive territory, but they are much less happy than they were in August or earlier this year. However, concerning the future, consumers are still quite optimistic about their future financial situation. So it's a mix. Not so happy about the present, but hopeful about the future. I think they also look at what's happening on the stock market. They still think that stock prices are going to continue to increase, which is supporting their financial situation in the future.
Thank you. So, moving on to spending, what trends are you seeing regarding consumers' willingness to purchase big ticket items that might be subject to tariffs?
So it's all over the place in recent months regarding big ticket items like appliances. We see some up and down. It depends on the different types of appliances. So it's not very clear that the tariffs is really affecting consumers' views, or maybe the fact that it's moving up and down. So some months they say, okay, I'm going to buy a fridge. Then the next month they say, no, I'm not going to buy a fridge, but I'm going to buy a dishwasher. It may be that they are just keeping their eyes on promotions. We know they are very concerned about inflation. They are concerned about higher prices. So they are becoming very opportunistic, and they are looking at when and where to buy depending on promotion discounts. That would go well with this kind of story that there is no clear pattern on this one. On electronics, we saw some improvement in recent months, so they still seem to be willing to buy electronic goods.
What I thought was interesting is that the housing plan, home purchasing plans seem to be improving. Is that correct? And why do you think so?
Yeah, so it's really improved, and especially in September, it may be associated with consumers seeing a bit of decline in terms of mortgage rates following the expectations. They saw that the Fed was going to cut rates, so there were expectations at the beginning of the month that the Fed was going to cut rates and that this would translate into potentially lower mortgage rates. They seem clearly more interested right now in buying homes.
Okay, that could be great for the housing market, especially for loosening up the existing home market, which is dependent upon lower mortgage rates before people will give up their existing low mortgage rate for something else, for something higher. So just two more questions. Looking at services, are consumers buying fewer services or more? And whatever they're buying, are you seeing a change in the mix versus discretionary versus necessary?
So in August, we clearly saw a shift to necessary services purchases. So there was a slowdown in everything that was discretionary, like traveling, going to attraction parks, entertainment. This really declined over the summer. In September, it's more like there is a decline across the board in terms of spending intentions for services. But it's also, again, really affecting dining out and also travel. So there is clearly a decline in consumers' willingness to go to hotels, buy travel for personal reasons. And this also shows up in our vacation question, where we've seen for a few months now a decline in consumers' intentions to go on vacation, whether in the US, but mostly also abroad.
So overall, what are consumers signaling about spending as we approach the holiday season?
So I think they are saying that prices remain the main thing they are looking at. So they're going to be very selective in their purchases. They're going to be looking for promotions. They are going to be careful. However, I just want to give a heads up. We are in October, we're going to run again our special question on how much consumers are planning to spend for the holiday seasons and which type of products. So I think at that time we'll get more insights about whether they're going to be spending a lot for the holiday season.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. That was fantastic. We're going to take a short break and be right back with more of our conversation, this time with Alex.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate the future of AI? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge from economics, marketing and communications, governance and sustainability, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to C-Suite Perspectives. Again, I'm Dana Peterson, Center Leader of the Economy, Strategy, and Finance Center at the Conference Board. Welcome, Alex.
Hello, Dana.
So, Alex, we're going to be talking about the global energy transition. So, it's 2025. Where are we with that transition globally?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Dana. It's interesting, 2025, this might be a very significant year because this might be the year, either this year or next year, when renewables, solar, wind, hydro, are going to overtake coal as having the largest share of electricity generation as percentage of the total. So in terms of the significance of that, we're going to approach a world energy system where roughly a third of the electricity generated comes from renewables. You can add in another 9–10% maybe from nuclear as a low carbon electricity form as well. And we're approaching almost half of total electricity generated, a little optimistic there, the calculation, in terms of global electricity generated from renewable sources. And that's a very significant accomplishment if you think about the big picture.
What changes have we seen over the last decade?
Yeah, so the decade, even if I broaden that window a little bit more and I say, let's start in, let's say, 2005, the share of solar and wind in 2005 was negligible. That was essentially 1% or 2% of total electricity generated globally. So over the last 20 years, we have seen rapid rise in the share of both of those energy types. And what has in part, or maybe predominantly, been the reason for this is the dramatic decline in cost. While it used to be the case that a solar installation was a massive investment 10, 15 years ago, all of a sudden we're now facing costs that have come down dramatically. On the solar side, maybe 85, 90% over the last 15 years or so in terms of the panels themselves. So that has really altered the landscape in terms of what's economically feasible. Wind has seen dramatic declines as well, not as dramatic as solar, but it's on a downward trend as well. So I think if you look at it that way, that's really what we're seeing. And this is in part just the economics of it. This is not necessarily policy determined, as we can talk about later.
Thanks, Alex. So, just looking across the globe, which regions or even economies are winning the race towards decarbonization?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think most of the decarbonization has taken place certainly in the power sector. And there, I think you can find some countries where the carbon intensity of the power system has dramatically declined. The United Kingdom is one of them. They shut down their last coal-fired power plant. I think it was last year. They're running now mostly on renewables on favorable days and importing some nuclear energy from France. So there's the whole system there has certainly moved towards decarbonization. But if you also look at the big countries in the world and the big blocks of economic activity, you can't go around mentioning China as one of the places on this planet where the push into renewables has been really supercharged, for lack of a better term. And there's been lots of investment. The share of coal, the amount of electricity generated from coal, has also been increasing, or at least not declining as much as one would have wanted. But the renewable share is dramatically going up. We're seeing some of that as well as in the European Union. And even in the US, where we're at slightly north of 20% from renewables, even that has been a strong trend. But going forward, that might look different.
So, you mentioned going forward. So, over the next 10 years, what are the most meaningful changes you anticipate that will affect the transition?
I think over the next 10 years, there's going to be a lot of changes in the energy sector, I would think. I think that solar and wind are going to drop further in cost. But I think if I just pick on two interesting trends, one is the investment in storage, because of the intermittency of solar and wind, investment in storage is becoming more and more important. And you can see that already in regional markets. Let's say take California, where large amounts of money have been invested in storage and batteries. They might be limited to 4-hour storage duration, but they really allow for the grid to be fed with electricity that is generated during the sunny daytime and then used in the sort of shoulder period in the evening and at night when households and businesses still require electricity. So I think that globally we will see much more investment in storage, and that will become a critical component of this energy transition. And then I think if we're looking at some other countries, what we also might see is that some countries, they will leapfrog in development. You can see that already in some parts of the country, in some parts of the world. Take Pakistan, or there's other examples like that, where they have initially grappled with unreliable electricity grids and then made the decision to heavily invest directly in solar. So they didn't necessarily have to take the natural progression that we've seen in a lot of developed economies, where we went into a system that is mainly fed by fossil fuel systems, fossil fuel generation, but they've directly jumped into solar. So I think it's interesting to note, because of the cost advantages, if more countries, especially in the developing world, there's lots of capacity that could be filled in Africa, for instance, directly by solar as the low-cost producer, that certainly from an economic perspective would make a lot of sense.
Yes, it does make a lot of sense, but we've noticed that there has been a reduction in government and policy support throughout the world. How is this going to affect the progress on greening?
Yeah, I think that's the critical question, and most analysts are holding their breath now in the second half of 2025 and then into 2026, just trying to assess if the trajectory of the adoption of solar and wind is going to continue. And ultimately, this is going to be the fine balance between a government support on the one hand, which has been cut back in many parts of the world, including the United States, and continued cost declines. The industry analysts, they look at this and say some of the tax advantageous treatment of, let's say, solar in the United States, this is not going to put us back 10 years or so, but it's going to put us back 3 or 4 years in terms of the cost curve that we're climbing down. So it's going to take away some of the advantage, but considering how much of a head start now solar actually has, and it's the lowest cost generation alternative in most parts of the world, my hope would be that trend is going to continue, but it will really be that balance, especially when it comes to either individual households or the individual businesses that make decisions for them economically. If it makes sense to invest in their own distributed solar facilities, and solar panels on the roof is what I'm talking about.
That's encouraging. There's still all these other challenges. So, how should businesses navigate these challenges going forward, and how should they plan?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of factors that come together for businesses. On the one hand, and we've written a lot about this, there's going to be increasing demand for electricity in the US as well as globally, in large part driven by the pickup in demand for data centers, AI, cryptocurrency, and the like. And while that is still a relatively small share of the total, the investments that are currently being made by some of the big tech firms, they are humongous. And as a result of that, we will see a real pickup in electricity demand going forward. Now, at the same time, what we haven't seen, unfortunately, is a matching investment volume in the grid infrastructure, not just in the US, but in other parts of the world as well. So the grids basically have been underinvested. And as a result of that, from a business perspective, you will probably have to deal with greater uncertainty, greater volatility in prices, also outages, any kind of fluctuations in service. So I think there is an incentive, there's sort of a point for businesses at some stage here to also think about their own supplies. Does it make sense for them to have a distributed solar facilities on their roof, on their warehouse, on their office park, whatever it might be, and match that with storage at the same time, which is now also affordable, which is in a sense going to make you independent of some of these grid problems that invariably we're going to run into. So I think businesses, they can, if assessing the situation correctly, they can really think about this as an opportunity to take advantage of some of the falling cost and the greater affordability when it comes to the infrastructure itself, to make themselves not fully independent, but certainly create greater resilience. And I think if we're thinking about the next 5 years, one of the big words that analysts are going to be talking about is going to be resilience of the electricity system.
Wow, that's a great conversation, Alex. We've come to the end of our discussion. Thank you so much, Stephanie and Alex, for joining me.
You're welcome, Dana.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And thanks to all of you for listening to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm Dana Peterson, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.